Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, about a month ago, we took a look at a video on chat history called The Most Embarrassing Royal Deaths of All Time. Well, he's got more of the same. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at part 2 of his Most Embarrassing Royal Deaths of All Time. And it looks like he's maybe thinking about making a part 3. So put the link down in the description so you can check it out. Let's go ahead and dive into this one. Oh no, not Grandpa
James. At just 6
James.
years old, itty-bitty Jimmy II of Scotland was an excited little prince eager to one day inherit the throne from his dear old dad, King James I. And
So you really need to look into the Stuarts of Scotland if you haven't already. The Stuart dynasty comes in a couple of generations after Robert the Bruce. And they rule Scotland all the way up until King James VI of Scotland, who is a Stuart, inherits the throne of England and becomes the king of both England and king of Scots. But there's a string of King Jameses. Basically it goes King James I, second, third, fourth, fifth, and then you have Mary Queen of Scots, and then King James VI. And a whole string of them die in not so natural ways. Die in battle, die from exploding cannon, die from getting murdered.
like that day is today.
Dad?
James I was a victim of a coup conducted by his power-hungry uncle who sought to seize the throne. His wife, the Queen, was injured but managed to survive despite being an intended target. Although certainly shaken, she stirred up quite the outcry from her Scottish subjects by putting her now very dead husband's corpse on display, and seeing the sheer brutality that had occurred, an all-out manhunt began for the men responsible. And these men were captured and brutally executed. With the old king gone, it was time to crown a new one. Being only 6 at the time of his dad's dastardly demise, Slimmy Jimmy Jr. was crowned on March 27th, 1437. But since he couldn't make any sound decisions as a drooling youth, his still-alive mom took power as regent, acting as ruler on James's behalf. But therein lies the problem. See, the people of Scotland are what we call Scottish. The Queen, now ruling over Scotland, hailed from England. You see the problem here. She was promptly pushed from power in favor of someone a bit more Scottish.
Wait, let's go back and look at that sign again.
Here. She was promptly pushed...
Scottish, cool beard, optional, sound like Shrek, played by a Canadian. Subscribed to chat history, dumb poofy haircut required, own a claymore.
From power in favor of someone a bit
Everything
more
tartan.
Scottish.
Bursting through the door is Archibald Douglas.
I don't think tartans were yet a big thing in Scotland at that point.
He's the king's much older first cousin.
He took the job but died a few years later from a fever since there wasn't a cowbell in sight. Power was then passed to these two fine fellows, Lord William Crichton and Sir Alexander Livingston. Their goal was to keep King James safe and in power, but in such a hostile political environment, with all of these seemingly random people trying to do their best to position themselves into more power.
Yeah, that's why almost always when you see a royal family, you see a monarchy where a child inherits the throne because of the early demise of the previous monarch, it almost always goes badly in one way or another. It almost always leads to some kind of infighting, some degree of scheming, and maybe even civil war, because you've got the monarch in name, but they're too young to rule, and so people are vying to control them and rule on their behalf.
Sometimes it takes a bit of violence to achieve those goals. The best example of said violence being the infamous Black Dinner. In 1440, Lord Crichton and Sir Livingston held a royal dinner at Edinburgh Castle, where the king resided.
And you can actually go to Edinburgh Castle and see the exact place where this happened, where this Black Dinner happened. It's sometimes been said that this is one of the inspirations for the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones, though in this case we're not dealing with an entire family of people, but it's the same concept. It's get rid of people who are a threat.
At the top of the invite list were 16-year-old William Douglas and his 10-year-old brother, David Douglas. They were the sons of former fever haver Archibald Douglas and a threat to the crown.
Yep.
While downing a hock of ham and a bushel of apples, or whatever they ate in those times, the brothers would soon learn that this dinner would come with a show. In the middle of the meal, a decapitated black bull's head was aggressively slammed onto the table in front of them. Ooh, dessert. Now, apparently having a black bull's bulbous block brutally bashed onto your beautiful buffet...
That was a lot of B words. Fairly certain that King James II, the young King James, was actually present for all of this as well.
...was a Scottish nobleman's friendly gesture of impending doom. Despite the young King James's pleas, the two boys were captured and beheaded right in front of him. Hardly appetizing. This historical power move was the direct inspiration for that red wedding scene in the Game of Thrones. Fast forward through a few years of childhood trauma to 1449, and the now 19-year-old James marries a nice lady named Mary, and she shoots out 7 kids. One of them dies. Very sad, but very typical. With his marriage and
Only one dying is actually kind of atypical.
of age, James's kingship switched from free trial to premium access. However, what was left of those dang Douglases are still fighting to retain power. If only there was a way for a king to take care of such an annoyance. Yeah, that works. James eventually wiped the Douglases from power and yoinked their lands.
And this is the problem, is that people are so power hungry in the moment when there's a young king that they don't think about the fact that at some point that king is going to grow up. You can't really touch the king. In rare cases they do, but in most cases you don't touch the king. That would be treason. But you can go after his officials and you can go after the people who are controlling him. But eventually that king is going to grow up and take power for himself. And then he might not look too kindly on the things that you did supposedly in his name.
And he was now in full control of his kingdom. Despite looking super spooky with his villainous vermilion birthmark covering half of his face like that one Avatar guy, I don't know his name, I never watched it, James was a very successful king. He was super social with commoners and advocated for advances in education, helping found the University of Glasgow in 1451. James was also a huge proponent of modern war technology, which, at the time, happened to be war cannons. These engineering marvels of bronze and iron were critical in besieging forts and castles, as cannonballs would just chew right through them things.
Sometimes. The problem was they were huge and they were hard to move. You go to Edinburgh Castle, you can see Mons Meg, which is this massive cannon from the 1400s, but it wasn't actually used all that often.
While attempting to capture Roxburgh Castle, one of the last Scottish castles still under smelly English control after the Scottish Independence Wars, King James II positioned himself next to one of his prized cannons, and after a few words of encouragement to his bombardment buddy, the king gave the order. Artillery! Fire!
And that's
The
the end of King
mounted
James.
metal menace exploded, killing King James II instantly at the age of 29. This rather unfortunate death was cemented in Scottish lore on August 3rd, 1460, and is officially, well, canon.
Of
In
Le
the middle of the
France.
Capetian dynasty, the Kingdom of France was ruled by this guy, Louis VI, also known as Louis the Fat, which is just mean. He should be called Louis the Body Positive. Anyway, this big fat asshole had 8 kids, and this chapter is all about his eldest son, Philip.
Call me Phil.
As was tradition in the Capetian dynasty to establish a clear lineage to the throne, young Philip was crowned as co-king of the Franks at the tender age of 13, right about the time when teen angst starts kicking in.
And this is all about making sure that there are no areas of ambiguity when it comes to who's going to inherit. We don't need anybody coming along and saying, well, I want the throne, and having the infighting. So you're establishing legitimacy for your heir, and you're making it clear while you're still alive, this is who my chosen successor is.
Although reportedly Louis's favorite child, Philip was a bit of a stinker. He would refuse to listen to his father's authority, fail to pay attention to any of the king's lectures and set standards for being a king, and devolved into being a disobedient little shithead, as kids tend to be. According to Walter Mapp, a historic writer during that time period, the continued arrogance and insubordination of the spry little king made him, quote, a burden to all. Like when you see a small child convulsing on the floor of your local Target because a 36-year-old man-child snatched the last Pokemon Prismatic Evolutions booster pack out of their clammy little ham hands while the parent just looked on in a dead stare.
That sounds really strangely specific, like that actually may have happened at some point.
Hang in there, man. Even though a troublesome youth, the problem would soon fix itself. In October of 1131, at age 15, young King Philip was chilling with the bros, racing through the streets on their one-horsepower tricked-out Mustangs, when everything was turned on its head. A small sable swine scuttled into the street, right in the path of the oncoming prince and his gang. Philip, who was leading the group, was catapulted off of his horse after it had tripped over the surprise pig.
This is one of those moments, we talk about this all the time, how split seconds determine the outcome of historic events. Where if something had been a half second earlier or a half a second later, if a person had been 3 feet to the right or 3 feet to the left, the entire history of the world changes. Imagine if Adolf Hitler had not been standing on the particular spot that he was in July of 1944 when a bomb went off and had been in fact a foot or two to one side. He's dead. The whole history of the world changes from that time on. This is another one of those instances.
Prince Philip slammed into the ground in a devastating crack and crunch of bone, fracturing all of his limbs and being rendered unconscious. Tragically, the young king had succumbed to his wounds the very next day. King Louis and his family were stricken with immense grief over the loss of their son. The little piggy went to market, but it should have stayed home. George II, King of Great Britain, began life as a tiny little bratwurst in Hanover, Germany in 1683. His father, also George, was the first king of the Hanoverian era and a rather combative parent.
Yeah, that's to say the least. Georg I, George I, did not even speak English. He's from Hanover, Germany. And George II did speak English, though German was still his first language.
Neither George liked the other and would always get into very heated and very public arguments over stuff like politics and other king things. But to be a little more specific, small George despised his dad's advisor, Robert Walpole, the guy considered—
I mean, he's not wrong though, right? I mean, it's Robert Walpole. If you know, you know.
To be the first British Prime Minister and the one who was really pulling all of the political strings behind the scenes.
So, obviously, this is something we need to do an entire video on at some point, how the British came to have a prime minister. But at least in part, you're dealing with a foreign king. You're dealing with a German king who doesn't even speak the language, who really doesn't even want to be the king of England. He really preferred to be, well, by this point, I guess we're talking about Great Britain, king of Great Britain. He really just would rather be back in Germany. So Robert Walpole was kind of running things on his behalf, and that develops into the prime minister.
Think Wizard of Oz, but with a smaller head and worse teeth. But one day, enough was enough. Big George banished Little George from the king's palace after a falling out. The prince was pretty okay with this. He and his wife lived in peace and quiet for quite a few years until, well, the king died. Time to go be a king. Prince George achieved his kingship in 1727 at the age of 43. Views of his reign as king were mixed. Despite squashing political uprisings, expanding the arts, laying the foundations for the Industrial Revolution, and overseeing many successful military conflicts, including leading his troops into battle himself at the age of 60, his English subjects just couldn't get over the fact that he was German, so, they were biased. Growing into his golden years, age started to really take a toll on the king. By 1760, King George II was 76, blind in one eye and hard of hearing.
And his heir, the Prince of Wales, Frederick, had died before him, and so now his heir is his grandson, who will become George III.
In the wee hours of October 25th, the rather fermented monarch rose from his bed, drank his iconic 6 a.m. hot chocolate, and excused himself to the loo to force out his own hot chocolate. But it was here on his cushy secondary throne that things took a turn for the worse. A servant stationed outside of the royal chambers heard a loud crash and comedically tore the door open to find the root of the commotion. What he found was the king on the floor, seemingly having just finished his business. George was lifted onto his bed and tended to by his physician, but his body crapped out on him. The king was dead. An autopsy of the royal remains indicated that the king had died as a result of a thoracic aortic dissection, the first reported case in history. See that tear right there in the aorta, the big artery leading into his artery? Yeah, that's not supposed to be there, but how it happened is the question. And it is believed that the blood pressure required to cause such a rupture on an old man's already weakened heart came from a rather forceful push of the pelvic floor muscles. So, in an attempt to relieve himself of his intestinal burden, the king relieved himself of this mortal coil. Remember to stay hydrated.
had not heard that one. The man literally died from straining too hard on the toilet. Dang. All right.
In a time where kings were given rather displeasing titles such as the Terrible or the Bad or the Slobberer, Martin of Aragon was granted the title of Martin the Humane. The
Not bad.
gracious nickname was a testament to his kind and caring nature. He basically earned it by being a bit less murdery than any other kings at the time. I mean, all the guy did was reconquer Sardinia, suppress revolts, and led crusades against the Moors in northern Africa. But
See, that's the thing. When the standard is here of how like sadistic most monarchs are at this time, and you come in right here, you're like, wow, look how humane this guy is.
Other than that, he's a perfect little angel, focusing on internal stability within his own kingdom of Aragon. But times of peace make for soft men. With little to no conflict to tend to in his later years, Martin grew older and wider. By 1410, at age 53, the king was rather rotund, wrinkled, and in a risky state of health, both physically and mentally. You see, his wife and his 4 children had died, leaving him all alone on his throne. He had married his distant and much younger cousin as a last-ditch effort to produce an heir, but with no
14 seems young to us now, but it wasn't that uncommon at that time.
success. The depressed and obese king had a little more to live for, and would instead gorge himself in solitude. On one fateful night, the king had just downed a whole roasted goose by himself. Where does he put it all? If you've ever slammed down a large meal too quickly, you usually get some pretty bad indigestion, or as I like to call it, the ERP. Since this was the land before Tums, the king had to sleep off his discomfort. He lumbered up to his royal chambers and shimmied himself into his rather strong bed. To cheer himself up a bit, Martin clapped his greasy meat hooks together, summoning his court jester for some late-night entertainment so he could hop aboard the train to Sleepy Time Junction with a smile, even though he had no
I mean, he didn't have a TV to watch. He couldn't play on his phone until he got tired, so you got to do something.
idea what a train even was. The jester apparently took his sweet time while being summoned, as he was asked about where he was the moment he entered the king's chambers. And this was when all hell broke loose. What the heck took you so long? Well, now hold on. I can't in good conscience let this play out with at least putting up a disclaimer. What you're about to hear is the joke that supposedly ended a nearly 300-year medieval dynasty. This is not for the faint of heart. You were warned. I was in the next vineyard, where I saw a young deer hanging by his tail from a tree, as if someone had so punished him for stealing figs. The king lost his absolute shit, reportedly slapping his belly in laughter for 3 hours straight, eventually falling out of his bed and collapsing on the ground where he lay dead from an apparent heart attack.
This seems to me like one of those like apocryphal stories that maybe didn't really happen that way, but the circumstances of the actual story were such that it was an easy embellishment to make. I don't know.
With no heirs to assume the throne, the House of Barcelona, after ruling the Crown of Aragon for 273 years, fell after the delivery of a single joke. Now, of course, historians debate if this story is even true,
Right.
as some accounts have Martin dying of the plague, food poisoning, or complications from his weight. But those are...
The key here is that we would have to look and see, when did this story come about that's how he died? Did it get written at the time? Was it contemporary? Are there other contemporary accounts that don't have him dying from that? Or did this come about much later on?
aren't nearly as funny. Archduke Alexander Leopold of Austria was a big dumb nerd. While the world of royalty focused on politics, land grabbing, and who could kill who more effectively, Alex instead played with his chemistry set in the corner, scribbling notes in a language called mathematics. It's no surprise that young Alex took a liking to the sciences, as his dad, Holy Roman Emperor guy Leopold II, was a strong advocate for Enlightenment principles and the study of natural sciences. Today's lesson is called gravity. Whoa, gravity. But since he was still an emperor's son, involvement in politics was inevitable. Take, for instance, the Kingdom of Hungary. It wasn't officially part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was somehow still ruled by it. There were governors in charge, but Emperor Leo...
Well, what you have is this is one of those scenarios where you have the monarch ruling over another territory that's not a part of the Holy Roman Empire, and so it's kind of joint under the same crown. It's what you initially had with England and Scotland. When King James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, he's king of England and he's king of Scots, but it's not one kingdom. They're two separate entities. Eventually, they get merged later on. And you have the same thing with the Austro-Hungarian Empire eventually.
Leopold was all, here's my son. Make him do something. And thus, little Alex was elected into a lordship position known as a palatine. He had a pretty good time in that position until the Jacobin conspiracy. A group of rebels were trying to have the Kingdom of Hungary break free from all Holy Roman Empire control, instead giving the royal crown to Alex. He very firmly said no, and the rebels were punished severely. With all of this political nonsense, Alex yearned for the simpler times of just mixing chemicals together to see what blows up. So in 1795, at the age of 22, Alex left Hungary for Vienna, Austria, and took up residence in Laxenburg Palace. Well, one summer, the young Archduke decided to turn up the heat and dabble in homemade pyrotechnics, a hobby that is famous for its safe and non-destructive nature. Expecting a visit from his cousin, Alex decided to rig up an extravagant fireworks display inside the palace.
Hey, just because you're educated doesn't mean you're smart.
To be fair, he, along with a few servants, set up the show within a fortified armory called a casemate, with the intent of firing the rockets towards the outside. So it's not like
And why are these casemates so heavily fortified? Well, because this is where you are firing from yourself, and so you want it to be well protected. The areas of a fort where your ammunition and your powder are going to be the best protected because you don't need explosions happening from within.
Decided to just shove firecrackers into a kitchen cabinet for shits and gigs. He was a man of science after all. Nevertheless, all gunpowder and makeshift explosives were stored inside the fortified walls. When his cousin arrived, he attempted to fire off the first rocket, but since Mother Nature has great comedic timing, a rogue gust of wind blew the rocket over, launching itself into other explosives and gunpowder reserves. Everything exploded, engulfing the Archduke and his servants in a goodness gracious great ball of fire. Talk about going out with a bang, am I right?
Dang, I didn't know that one either.
The title of king kinda just fell into the lap of old Adolf Frederick of Sweden in 1751. During the Age of Liberty, a time in history when the Swedish parliament was all... Adolf's rule as king was essentially worthless. He was no more than a political figurehead while all the real guys in fancy wigs did the ruling.
This is the time when you've got the 7 Years' War in Europe. Sweden as an empire is on the decline now. And of course, like a lot of European powers, the power is shifting from the monarch to an elected legislature.
But apparently not very well, because by the end of the Age of Liberty in 1772, Sweden was kind of worse for the wear. Its land ownership had diminished.
You see the name of parliament there, Reichstag, which sounds a lot like the Reichstag in Germany. Well, Sweden, Swedish is a North Germanic language, and there's a lot of similarities in the language.
Trade had evaporated and technological advancements were lagging, so Sweden was forced to sit back and watch its neighbors and rivals proudly wave around their large, throbbing economies. During King Adolf's lavishly lackadaisical leadership, nothing extraordinary happened.
The substandard sovereign did attempt to regain power, but failed to do so, because he sucked.
In fact, his entire reign is seen as a dull but peaceful lull in Swedish history with not much to show for it. And unfortunately for the king, the only exciting point in his life, at least from a historical perspective, was his death. According to some historical records, the rather indulgent king had overindulged himself on some food. On February 12, 1771,
seems to be two common themes in today's episode: explosives and food.
King's Last Supper reportedly consisted of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. Oh, and a few of these bad boys. This is a semla, a traditional Swedish sweet roll stuffed with almond paste and whipped cream, and hot damn does it look tasty. And that's exactly what the king thought as he inhaled 14 of them. Not surprisingly, all of that food did not sit well in the king's tummy, and all that internal stress is believed to have caused heart failure. The poor guy straight up ate himself to death. Now, before the actually crowd starts pounding away on their greasy keyboards, this tale of his death is regarded as propaganda and is highly discredited by modern historians. The official autopsy report for the king has survived all of these years and has concluded, based on all the evidence that they could gather from sleuthing around the king's insides, that his royal majesty had a stroke. Now, suffering from a stroke is rough, but for a king that wasn't up
Why are we showing a golf course? Stroke?
par, it's a fair way to go. That's some golf humor for you. So there you have it. That's part 2 of Embarrassing Royal Deaths.
All right, so interesting. Not a part of history we talk much about, but fascinating nonetheless. And there are plenty of non-royal deaths that are equally kind of crazy and fascinating. And I don't know why, it's always been a part of history that I've been very interested in, is the strange ways that people meet their demise, because we're just very fragile creatures when it all comes down to it. So something to think about. Thanks for watching.